To be a good son-in-law, there's a lot of things you need to do. You need to be respectful. You need to be kind, caring, and loving to your spouse. And you also need to watch all of Seinfeld so that you get all of your father-in-law's jokes and references. I'm a good son-in-law, so I've been watching Seinfeld and thinking about some of those classic jokes that Seinfeld really actually created. And one of the most classic jokes in all of comedy sitcoms is something called the double take. It's where something ridiculous or absurd or unbelievable is happening, and a character just walks by it like it's not even happening. And then it takes a moment for their brain to catch up, and they look back, and their brain still can't quite process what they're seeing. And the truth is, while this may be ridiculous, it kind of happens to us sometimes in life. Something inexplicable, something our brain just can't process or understand happens, and we move right past it and sometimes look back. And even when we're staring at it, we still can't quite understand what's going on. Now, I'm not going to claim that there's a comedic moment like that in this week's Parsha of Mishpatim, but there is a verse that the first time I read it years ago, and even when I reread it every year, I look around and I say, did anyone read this? This is how do we understand what's going on here? So a little background. Last week we received the Aseret Hadibrot called the Ten Commandments. These are 10 fundamental principles, mitzvot, in their own right, but they also kind of lay the foundations for what our nation stands for, our unique relationship with Hashem, with Shabbat, protecting civilization. But that's not enough to do a whole nation. You need more laws to make everything work. Hence, this week's Parsha of Mishpatim, dozens of laws about how to really run a society, civil and ritual laws as well. And near the end, there's this review, a rewind moment. We're remembering this covenantal moment, this promise where Moshe does a ceremony and sprinkling of blood, and then he starts to go up Har Sinai, the mountain, with Moshe and Aharon and Nadav and Abihu and 70 of the elders. And there's something that really inexplicable that you read the verse and you can either just move on or stop and say, wait, what happened? And this is the verse. It's in chapter 24, verse 10. As these leaders went up to Har Sinai, Vayiru et Elokei Yisrael, ve'tachat raglav kema'aseh livnat hasapir, uche'etzem hashamayim latahor. You read it and you say, okay, moving on to the next verse. But what it says is, and they, all these people, not just Moshe, but these 70 plus men, saw Elokei Yisrael. They saw God. Not only did they see God, but under God's feet, tachet raglav, as if God had feet, kevayochel, they would say, there was this kind of sapphire, sapphire likeness, something, some sort of structure that Hashem is standing on, striking a regal pose, just like the beautiful blue of the sky. And there's so much going on here that our brain can't process. And in fact, the very fact that our brain can't process what's going on here will actually help us explain what's going on here. So what do I mean? So when you look at the commentaries of the rabbis, a lot of them will focus on describing what is the sapphire, what is the sapphire color. But what struck me is, wait, they saw God. Now, there is a famous story of Moshe saying, God, let me see you. And Hashem reveals part of God's back to Moshe, which turns his hair white. So it's too much for Moshe, certainly for all of these people, yet it's seen. So the rabbis have many different ways to approach this. The 13th century in France, you have the Chizkuni, a beautiful work, where he says that it was a b'mareh u'v'nevuah, that it was a prophetic image. And we actually have in the book of Yechezkel and Ezekiel, where he's having a dream by the river, a prophetic dream about people returning to the land of Israel after the destruction, about Hashem's throne and all of these angels. Now, what's unique here is he doesn't really see God. He sees God's glory, God's great throne room, and those who, the secret service, as it were, who protect God. He sees all that stuff around it, but not God. But here, and there are those who indeed suggest that, they didn't actually see God there. They saw this blinding light that was connected to God, that goes wherever God's presence is. But that's a nice, beautiful answer. And then we go on to Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, and he brings up again the story of the back, Moshe seeing Hashem's back. And what he uses this explicit language of ka'ain, he says it's as if they were seeing it with their eye, meaning they didn't actually see God. They just saw something that looked like God to them. And this becomes very important. It actually comes out Rambam in Maimonides in his book, the Mishnah Torah, and his Yesodei Torah, where he's laying out the fundamental principles of belief. And for the Rambam, one of his most important missions was to let us know that God does not have a body. There is nothing to see. So why did the Torah say that they saw something? And the answer that Rambam would suggest here is that when people talk, we need language. We don't know how to communicate without some form of language. Even sign language is a language. Even hints and nods and gestures are a form of language. People need certain physical, concrete things to be able to communicate and understand the world. So when these people, Moshe, Aharon, Nadav, Avihu, and the 70 elders, when they came close to Hashem's presence, Hashem wanted to reveal some part of Hashem. Hashem wanted them to understand what God is, but their human brains could only understand human ideas. Just like Ezekiel, Yechezkel could only understand fire and thrones and light, so his vision came in the shape of fire and thrones and light. So too these people could only relate to the world through a king on a throne or through great, great light. So for them, when they saw God, what they perceived was what they were expecting to see. And an interesting commentary that a number of rabbis say is when it talks about this sapphire, it specifically says bricks of sapphire, because for them, they were all used to living under Paro, and his whole thing was, Israelites, build me bricks, 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 build me beautiful buildings with bricks. All they thought of was the king is giving us more and more bricks. So when they look at the King of Kings, they see this beautiful sapphire, the color of the sky that reminds them of the universe, and it's in the shape of bricks. So their life experiences colored the way that they perceived God. But the important takeaway here is this. We, all of us, are going to have shared experiences that we're not going to know how to process. We're not going to understand whether it's something great joy or something very tragic, like what the world is going through right now. But the only way that we can process it is to put it in language that makes sense to us. And that's a really important message when any of us go through a tragedy, whether we lose a family member or whether we're deeply injured. For us to understand it, we need to have language. We need to have systems, whether it's a hug from someone we love, whether it's language that might be trite or a platitude like, it's going to be okay. That might be the only way, the only language that makes sense to us to help us process things. And today in this digital age, we have tweets, we have Facebook posts, and how many times do we have someone who's gone through something deeply traumatic, and the only way for them to process it is to put out a Facebook post asking for support. And the truth is, there's nothing wrong with that, because that is the only way that their mind can cope with the world. So going back to the original verse, when I read it and said, how did they see Hashem, and what's the sapphire, and what's going on here? My brain can't process it. And the fact is that for these people, they couldn't process the greatness of God, the infinity of God, but they could process seeing some sort of light being standing on a pile of bricks. That's what their minds needed to see in that moment. So as we go through this unprecedented time, think about, what are your coping mechanisms? When you look at the world, if you try and take it all in at once, it'll melt your brain, it'll turn your hair white. But if you think about what are some of the coping mechanisms you have, love, friendship, trying to read articles in certain newspapers, late talk show hosts that help you process things, that's okay. We need those coping mechanisms. That is what makes us human. That is why for us, angels have wings. They don't. But for us, that's a way that we can understand the world. So what tools do you have to understand the world? Because I think the Torah is trying to tell us here that it's okay to use those tools to help us understand it, not to build statues of it, but when we process something in our heart, whatever we need to do to make sense of it, that's okay, and that is sacred, and that is holy. With that, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, and be well.